A racist cop pressed charges against the wrong black man, without knowing he was a United States Supreme Court judge, and what happened to that officer shocked everyone. It started just before sunrise, on the white stone steps of a federal courthouse. The city was still quiet, early morning mist curling around street lamps, the echo of heels on granite breaking the silence. A black man, well dressed in a charcoal suit and long coat, made his way up the steps like he had for years. Confident. Calm. Belonging. But before he could pull out the security badge in his pocket, red and blue lights slashed through the fog, tires screeched, and a voice thundered from behind. "Don't move. Let me see your hands. Get on your knees now." At first, he froze. He thought there was a mistake. He turned slowly, raising his hands, voice steady. "I work here." Shut the hell up," the officer barked, slamming the car door, hand already on his gun as he marched up the stairs. "You're trespassing on federal property. You think wearing a damn suit makes you invisible?" "I said I work here," the man repeated, calm but confused, instinctively reaching into his coat for his ID. The officer pulled his weapon, screaming, "Hands out. Hands out now or I'll drop you right here." A moment later, the man was slammed to the ground, his face crushed into cold concrete, arms twisted back, knees in his spine. No one around him intervened. No one questioned it. His briefcase flew open, papers scattered, legal documents stamped with the federal seal, but they might as well have been invisible. All they saw was a black man in a nice coat, in a place they didn't believe he belonged. "I'm a judge," he tried again, the words muffled into the concrete. The cop laughed. "And I'm the president. Save it for your lawyer." That's how it began. A man of dignity and decades of service, treated like a criminal in front of the building that bore his authority. Handcuffed, fingerprinted, photographed. Placed in a cold holding cell beneath the very courtrooms where he'd spent his career upholding the Constitution. They wouldn't even call his clerk. They didn't believe a word out of his mouth. Why would they? To that cop, he was just another black man who looked like he didn't belong. That's all it took. By noon, the press had caught wind of the trespasser incident. The department released a statement claiming suspicious behavior and noncompliance. They were quick to defend the officer. He was just doing his job. There were procedures. Threat assessments. Policy. But by late afternoon, the truth hit like a wrecking ball. The man they cuffed on the stairs. He wasn't just a judge. He was one of the most respected legal minds in the country. A sitting Supreme Court justice. A man who had sworn in a president. A man whose decisions had shaped the lives of millions. And the officer, he had no idea. No clue. No instinct that maybe he should listen, just for a second, before dragging an innocent man through hell. Because in his eyes, black equaled threat. And that was all it took. The country erupted. Social media exploded with rage. Video footage leaked, security cams, bystanders, courthouse feeds, every angle showing the same thing, a peaceful, respected man being brutalized in broad daylight. Hashtags surged. Civil rights attorneys spoke out. Protesters gathered outside the very station the officer worked in, demanding justice, accountability, change. But none of them knew what was about to happen next. Because the man in that cell didn't scream. He didn't retaliate. He didn't post. He didn't beg for sympathy. He waited. He waited until the moment when the officer who humiliated him, who laughed at him, who accused him, who shackled him like a dog, was called to testify. Thinking it was just another internal review. Thinking he could defend his actions, spin the story, maybe get a slap on the wrist. Because that's how it usually goes, right? But when the courtroom doors opened, when the judge entered, the color drained from the officer's face. He stood. He blinked. He stumbled. Because the man in the robe, sitting behind the bench with authority dripping from every word? It was him. The same man he had dragged across stone steps like trash. The same man he shoved in a patrol car. The same man he dismissed as nobody. And now, that nobody held his badge, his future, and his fate in the palm of his hand. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. Every eye turned. Every camera flashed. And in that moment, the power dynamic wasn't just reversed, it was shattered. No screaming. No vengeance. Just justice. But here's the thing, what the judge decided to do wasn't what anyone expected. Because the real twist wasn't in the revenge. It was in the mercy. The courtroom didn't see it coming. The cop didn't see it coming. And neither will you. So now the question is, what do you think a man should do, when the one who humiliated him, is now completely at his mercy? Stay with us to find out. To every black viewer watching this right now, we see you, we stand with you, and we will never be silent. Plow of Twist does not support any form of racism, discrimination, or injustice, ever. Your life matters. Your story matters. And stories like this are made to remind the world of that truth. Now, enjoy this powerful journey of justice and redemption. And don't forget, subscribe to Plow of Twist for more real, raw, and unforgettable stories. It began in Richmond, Virginia, a city steeped in history, contradiction, and quiet tension. Old stone buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with shimmering glass towers, as if the past and future had been forced into an uneasy truce. In the heart of downtown, the Supreme Federal Courthouse loomed with authority, tall columns, echoing chambers, walls that had heard every kind of plea and confession. To many, it was just a government building. But to Judge Marcus Ellison, it had been both sanctuary and battleground for most of his adult life. Marcus was a man carved by discipline. Not the kind you put on paper to impress others, but the kind that took root when the world tried to break you and you refused to bend. His skin was deep brown, his presence quiet but undeniable. He wore tailored suits with subtle colors, always carried a pen in his jacket pocket, not for show, but for the weight of his decisions. Every morning, long before the city fully woke, Marcus walked up the courthouse steps in silence, absorbing the chill, the stillness, the ritual. He believed in law, in structure, in fairness, not because the world had always been fair to him, but because he knew what happened when it wasn't. He had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a home full of loud love and constant struggle. His mother cleaned houses, his father worked overnight shifts loading freight. They taught him how to speak carefully, how to watch everything and say little, how to hold his head high without making others feel like he was staring down. He'd been underestimated for so long that he learned to turn doubt into fuel. And when he made it into law school, and later onto the bench, there was no applause. Just his mother's quiet tears and his father's long exhale. That was enough. At 53, Marcus was considered one of the most respected justices in the federal judiciary, sharp-minded, brutally fair, and meticulously composed. He never raised his voice in court. He never interrupted. But when he looked at you, you listened. His judgments were known for their clarity, their precision. Some said he was too stern, too cold. But those who knew him beyond the black robe understood the warmth he guarded, the empathy behind the exactness. He wasn't just interpreting the law, he was protecting it from the rot of ego and prejudice. He lived alone in a brownstone a few blocks from the courthouse, a home filled with history books, vinyl jazz records, and framed photos of a younger Marcus standing beside mentors, old professors, and, in one black and white shot, a civil rights leader whose hand he'd shaken as a boy. Marcus didn't go out much. He didn't crave attention. His joy came in small moments, correcting an unjust sentencing, watching a young public defender grow into their strength, mentoring students from neighborhoods like the one he came from. Meanwhile, on the other end of the city, another man started his morning in a very different rhythm. Officer Scott Delaney had been with the Richmond Police Department for almost 10 years. Tall, stocky, with the kind of jawline that looked carved out of granite, Scott moved like a man who had always believed in his own authority. His record showed dedication, lots of field hours, steady promotions, but quietly, among colleagues and supervisors, there was a pattern of behavior that made some uneasy. His use of force reports were higher than average. His traffic stops disproportionately targeted Black and Latino drivers. And while no formal complaints had ever stuck, there were whispers in the locker room, nervous glances at briefings. Scott didn't see himself as racist. In fact, he often went out of his way to say he treated everyone the same. But his definition of same was rooted in suspicion, not fairness. He'd grown up in a small town just outside Richmond, raised by a father who saw the world in binaries, strong or weak, good or bad, us or them. His worldview had been shaped not by empathy, but by control. And behind his badge, Scott felt untouchable. He took silence as submission. Obedience as proof of guilt. And when he stepped out of his cruiser each morning, he wore his authority like armor. That particular morning had started like any other. Cold air, hot coffee, early patrol. He'd been circling downtown when he spotted a man alone on the courthouse steps. A black man in a dark coat, briefcase in hand, looking, at least in Scott's eyes, out of place. The courthouse wasn't open yet. The man had paused on the steps, as if waiting. And that was enough. Scott's instincts kicked in. He didn't radio for confirmation. Didn't pause to assess. He just reacted. Moments later, Marcus found himself facing the very thing he had spent his life trying to dismantle, not through protests or speeches, but through pages and precedent. The officer shouted orders, threatened him, drew his weapon. And Marcus, knowing the cost of resistance, complied. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood the rules of survival when skin color is read as threat. The cold cuffs cut into his wrists. His knees hit stone. His papers spilled from his briefcase like broken truths. And even as he spoke, clearly, calmly, asserting his identity, it didn't matter. In the eyes of that officer, his words were just noise. He was taken to the precinct. Fingerprinted. Searched. Questioned. Still in disbelief, still maintaining his composure. He knew this system. Knew how often it protected its own. Knew that any anger, any protest from him, would be used against him later. So he endured. And as hours passed, as junior officers watched the scene with uncertainty and silent shame, Marcus never raised his voice. At the same time, Scott filled out the paperwork, confident he had caught someone trying to break into federal property. He even joked with another officer about how fast the guy folded. There was no remorse. No hesitation. In his mind, he'd done the job. Protected the institution. Maintained the peace. What Scott didn't realize, what he couldn't imagine, was that the man he had dragged from the steps of the courthouse had walked those very halls with power far beyond his comprehension. The precinct was buzzing. Whispers started to spread when someone finally confirmed the man's identity. Eyes widened. Heads turned. And as realization crept in, the silence became suffocating. No one knew how to fix it. No one wanted to be the one to tell Scott. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. When Marcus was finally released, hours later, he didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply asked for his belongings, looked the desk sergeant in the eye, and walked out. No press. No outburst. But the air in that building had shifted. Something irreversible had been set in motion. And now, both men were on a path neither of them could escape. One built his life on law and honor. The other, on control and assumptions. Their collision wasn't just about race or power, it was about what happens when the truth is forced to kneel, and whether justice will finally be allowed to stand tall again. What neither of them knew that morning, however, was that the courtroom would soon become the stage for something far greater than a disciplinary hearing. That the lines between guilt and innocence, authority and humility, would blur in front of the nation. And that one man's silence would echo louder than any accusation ever could. But when the moment came, when the tables turned, when judgment passed not from rage but from wisdom, what would be more powerful? Justice served, or mercy revealed? That answer is still to come. The following days passed with a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the kind of silence that comes just before a storm. Judge Marcus Ellison returned to his work as though nothing had happened. He moved through his chambers with his usual grace, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Not anger. Not vengeance. Something quieter. More calculated. Every file he touched, every case he reviewed, was handled with surgical precision. But anyone paying attention could feel it, the air around him was denser, heavier, like the weight of something unspoken pressing inward. His clerks noticed first. They exchanged glances when he skipped morning greetings. When he didn't sip the coffee they left on his desk, still hot. When he reread case briefs more times than necessary. One of them finally asked, gently, "Is everything all right, Your Honor?" Marcus simply nodded and said, "Schedule the review for Thursday." No delays. It was clear that nothing in the room had changed, but everything in him had. Meanwhile, whispers had begun to swirl within the Richmond Police Department. Scott Delaney had been pulled into a private meeting with his captain, who shut the blinds and locked the door. There were no formal charges. Not yet. But the tension was unmistakable. "You need to be careful," the captain said, leaning forward, voice low. "There's more to this than you understand. We're hearing things from DC now. The man you arrested, he's not some public defender. He's sitting high. We need to talk about damage control." Scott crossed his arms and scoffed. "So now we're letting people off because of who they are?" The captain's eyes hardened. "No. We're holding you accountable because of who you're not." Scott felt the floor beneath him tilt slightly. "I followed protocol." He was suspicious. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem," the captain said, staring him down. "You didn't care to ask." Back at the courthouse, the judiciary had begun to stir. Emails began to circulate behind closed doors. Some judges wanted to make a public statement. Others feared the political fallout. But Marcus made one thing clear to his colleagues: he didn't want this to become a media circus. He didn't want to see his name on hashtags or banners. He had other plans. Quiet plans. Legal plans. Plans no one saw coming. He requested a review hearing, standard protocol when judicial officers are involved in public incidents. But what was unusual was the scope. He didn't just request a review of his personal case. He included an entire set of departmental patterns tied to Officer Delaney's service history. Dozens of stops. Arrests. Reports. Bodycam footage. He cited federal precedent. He invoked constitutional grounds. The submission was airtight, unreadable by the untrained, but damning in every sentence. No fury. Just facts. Just truth sharpened into a weapon. When the date of the hearing was finally set, the list of attendees included senior state attorneys, department heads, internal affairs, and representatives from the Civil Rights Division. But it was Scott who walked into the building with shoulders stiff, jaw clenched, refusing to acknowledge the cameras posted at the entry. A few journalists had caught wind of the review and began circling like vultures. Scott looked down and kept walking, his badge still clipped to his belt, his gun still holstered. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong. At least, not enough to deserve what everyone was whispering about. Inside the hall, Marcus sat in his robe, elevated behind the bench, flanked by legal counsel. His expression was unreadable. Every seat was filled. The room buzzed with anticipation, though no one dared to speak. When Scott walked in, their eyes met for the first time since that morning on the courthouse steps. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition. Tension. Something that made Scott's confidence flicker for just a second. The first half of the session moved with formal structure. Evidence was presented. Testimonies reviewed. Footage played on screens that made the room go cold. In one clip, Scott's voice rang out, harsh and immediate. His words, "Don't lie to me, boy," echoed in the silence, uglier out loud than they'd sounded in his head. Several attendees shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others looked down. The truth, now unavoidable, was on full display. When the review committee opened the floor for questioning, Marcus leaned forward slightly and asked a single question, "Officer Delaney, why didn't you listen to me when I told you who I was?" Scott hesitated. "I didn't recognize you, sir." "That wasn't the question," Marcus said, eyes locked onto his. Scott took a breath. "Because, people lie. Because I've had people say all kinds of things to avoid arrest." "You looked," he stopped himself, but it was too late. Marcus's voice lowered. "I looked, how?" Scott's mouth tightened. "I thought you were suspicious. So wearing a suit and carrying legal documents at a courthouse made me suspicious." "It was early," Scott said quickly, eyes darting to the committee. "It wasn't open yet. You weren't supposed to be there. I was protecting the building." Marcus tilted his head. "From me?" Silence. The kind that makes clocks tick louder. Another member of the committee cleared her throat. "Officer Delaney, are you aware that Judge Ellison has had unrestricted 24-hour access to the courthouse for the past 21 years? Scott didn't answer. He didn't need to. When the session adjourned for the day, no one left immediately. There was a quiet gravity in the air, like something was unraveling slowly. And yet, Scott still didn't understand what was truly happening. He thought it was a disciplinary review. He thought maybe he'd be suspended. Maybe demoted. He didn't yet understand that this wasn't about his mistake. It was about the system that made his mistake so easy. So normal. Outside the courthouse, protesters had gathered. Signs raised. Voices chanting. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about every name before his. Every headline. Every black man forced to prove his worth to a badge that never saw it. Inside, Marcus sat alone in his chambers, watching the crowd through a high window. His fingers tapped rhythmically on a folder in his lap. A folder filled with sealed documents. Case files. Testimonies from people who'd crossed paths with Officer Delaney over the years and never found justice. Until now. He opened a drawer and placed the folder inside. His clerk stepped in and asked, "Is there anything you'd like me to prepare for tomorrow?" Marcus shook his head. "No. Tomorrow speaks for itself." And just like that, the day ended. But what the world didn't yet know, what even Scott Delaney couldn't fathom, was that the next session wouldn't just determine his future. It would expose something far deeper. A truth buried in plain sight. A moment that would redefine not only their lives, but the very meaning of justice inside that room. Because the storm wasn't coming. It was already here. The second day of the hearing began with the kind of silence that doesn't come naturally. It had weight, shape, a pressure that filled the hallways and stuck in the lungs of everyone who entered the courtroom. The marble floors, polished and cold, reflected faces tight with tension. Press badges hung from necks like nooses. Phones were silenced but screens stayed lit, ready to capture the exact moment when everything changed. Officer Scott Delaney sat at the defense table, eyes fixed forward but not truly focused. The crowd wasn't whispering anymore. They were waiting. Watching. As if something sacred and irreversible was about to happen. When Judge Marcus Ellison entered, no one stood, because today, he wasn't presiding in the traditional sense. He was present as a witness. A victim. And more than that, as a man who, for the first time in his long career, had been violently reminded that the law didn't always protect those who built it. The presiding committee called the hearing to order. Papers shuffled. Names were stated. But beneath the formalities, a current of something deeper moved like an undercurrent, grief, perhaps. Rage. Anticipation. Marcus's presence alone brought gravity to the room. And yet he looked calm. Not empty, not broken, but still. Like someone who had already seen what was coming, and had prepared for it in silence. Then, a name was called from the bench. Officer Scott Delaney, please rise. Scott stood. Not as tall as usual. His chin didn't lift as high. He looked at the floor, then quickly up toward Marcus, as if seeking something. A signal. A sign of restraint. But Marcus's gaze offered nothing. No threat. No kindness. Just truth. The committee chair leaned forward. We have reviewed the evidence presented and examined the circumstances of your conduct. But there is one more item that has been submitted, confidentially, by the complainant. It concerns your past conduct and your future eligibility to serve as a law enforcement officer in the state of Virginia. There was a pause. Something shifted in the room. Attention thickened. The chair then turned to Marcus. Your Honor, with your permission, we would like to open the sealed file you submitted yesterday afternoon. Marcus gave a single nod. And then, the air changed. The folder was opened. The first page slid into view on the overhead projector. It wasn't just a report. It was a complaint filed 5 years earlier by a public defender whose client had been violently arrested during a routine traffic stop, by Officer Delaney. The man had suffered a concussion. Charges were dropped. But no internal investigation followed. The file had been quietly buried. The second page showed a bodycam transcript, Delaney, mid-arrest, using language that was nearly identical to what he had used with Marcus. You fit the profile, he had said. You think that suit makes you one of us? The third page hit harder. A complaint filed by a former academy instructor who had flagged Delaney's psychological evaluation. Not for instability, but for an unexamined bias under pressure. Her words were clear: he performs well in training, but his reactions shift around black male figures of authority. It's subtle, but it's consistent. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The final page was a signed affidavit. Not from a victim, but from a former partner of Delaney's who had since left the force. His words stung like open wounds. Scott doesn't see himself as racist, but he operates with fear. Not of violence, but of being challenged by someone he can't control. And when that someone is black, it triggers something in him that he won't admit, but everyone around him knows exists. Scott's face drained of color. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then he finally said, in a voice almost too low to hear, "Why are you doing this?" Marcus stood slowly. Not with anger, not with triumph. Just presence. "I'm not doing anything to you," he said, voice firm. "You did this to yourself. I'm doing something for the people who came before me and never got to stand in this room with their dignity intact." Scott shook his head. "You could have ruined me from the beginning. You could have gone public, sued, destroyed my name. Why, wait? Why now?" Marcus stepped forward, closer than he had ever stood to him. Their eyes locked. The air between them was electric, but not violent. "Because what you did to me wasn't new," Marcus said, his voice soft but unflinching. "It's old. It's a shadow we've all lived under for too long. But I needed you to feel it. To see it. To understand that silence isn't weakness. That restraint isn't forgiveness. I waited because if I'd reacted in anger, the story would have become about me. About whether I was emotional, out for revenge. But this isn't about revenge. It's about reckoning." Scott swallowed hard. "So what now?" You take my badge, my career. You humiliate me in front of everyone. Marcus took a breath. I don't need to humiliate you. The truth already did. The committee resumed its deliberation. The room sat frozen in time. Phones stayed off. No one dared to speak. And then, the verdict was read aloud. Effective immediately, Officer Scott Delaney is relieved of duty. He is barred from future employment in law enforcement within this jurisdiction and referred for federal review regarding patterns of misconduct. A wave of reaction surged. No cheers. No applause. Just the sound of justice, rare and heavy, finally speaking aloud. Scott sank back into his chair, visibly shaking. For once, he wasn't the one holding power. And he knew it. After the session adjourned, reporters surged forward. Cameras clicked. Questions flew. But Marcus walked past them without a word. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had doubled. They parted as he approached, letting him through like water around a stone. He didn't raise his arms. Didn't wave. He just kept walking. Until one young man in the crowd stepped forward and asked, Your Honor, why didn't you let him rot? Marcus paused. Looked him in the eyes. Because the point was never to make him suffer, he said. The point was to show the world that accountability doesn't have to scream. Sometimes, it just has to stand tall. And with that, he disappeared into the city. But inside the courthouse, inside the people who had witnessed what had just unfolded, a seed had been planted. Something quiet. Something powerful. Something that would grow. Because today, justice had a face. And it looked exactly like the man they said didn't belong. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the tension that had pressed against the walls like a storm cloud didn't vanish, it lingered, thick in the air, clinging to every breath like smoke after a fire. Officer Scott Delaney remained seated, hunched forward, his elbows on the table and his hands locked tightly, white at the knuckles. His eyes were fixed on the floor, unmoving, as if staring at the last remains of his identity scattered somewhere beneath his feet. Around him, murmurs fluttered like distant thunder, but none of it registered. The weight of what had just happened settled into his chest like lead, and for the first time, the badge on his hip felt less like a symbol of power and more like an echo of everything he had misunderstood about himself. Judge Marcus Ellison stood at a distance, near the double doors, his robe already removed, draped over one arm. His shoulders were still firm, posture still regal, but his eyes held something more complex now, fatigue, sorrow, and a quiet kind of release. One of the committee members approached him and whispered something about a press statement, but Marcus raised a hand gently, signaling no. This wasn't about performance. It wasn't about scoring points or rallying applause. Justice wasn't a spectacle. It was a burden. And today, that burden had simply been lifted, not celebrated. Scott eventually looked up and met Marcus's gaze across the room. No words were exchanged, but something moved in that silence, a fragile acknowledgement of reality too late recognized. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, not with approval, but with finality. Then he turned and walked toward the hallway, only to hear Scott's voice behind him, low and broken. Wait, please. Marcus stopped but didn't turn around immediately. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, then turned his head just enough to meet Scott's eyes. I didn't think this would go this far, Scott said, standing now, his voice trembling, not with rage but confusion. I thought if I just explained, if they just saw I wasn't trying to be cruel. Marcus stepped toward him, one quiet footfall after another, until they were face to face again. This time, no podium, no courtroom barrier. Just two men in a hallway, surrounded by ghosts. You thought you were doing your job, Marcus said, voice steady, not harsh. But the truth is, you were doing your job exactly how the system trained you to. That's what makes it worse. Scott looked down, jaw clenched. I didn't see you as a judge. I didn't see anything. I just reacted. That's the problem, Marcus replied. You weren't supposed to see me as a judge. You were supposed to see me as a man. The words hit harder than any gavel. Scott leaned back slightly, as if the realization came with physical force. He opened his mouth to respond, but there was nothing left to say. Instead, his expression shifted, layers of denial, defensiveness, and finally, something resembling remorse. I ruined everything, he whispered. Marcus's gaze softened, but only slightly. No. You exposed everything. There's a difference. For a moment, they stood in silence, not adversaries, not symbols, just two men caught in the wreckage of something much older than either of them. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to Scott, who looked down at it in confusion. What's this? Marcus nodded at the paper. It's a referral to a restorative justice program. They're partnered with federal oversight. Not mandatory. You can decline. But it's not about redemption for me. It's about understanding. It's about making sure the next man who looks like me doesn't have to be the one in the robe to survive you. Scott's hand trembled slightly as he took the paper. You want me to face the people I've hurt? No, Marcus said, his voice heavy. I want you to listen to them. Truly listen. For the first time. A long pause stretched between them. Scott nodded slowly, the gesture awkward, unsure. He still didn't understand the full weight of what he had been offered, but he understood enough to know it wasn't what he deserved. It was more. Behind them, the sound of camera shutters started to rise again, a signal that the world outside had not forgotten what had just unfolded. Marcus turned away, ready to disappear once more into the quiet dignity that had always defined him. But as he reached the end of the corridor, another voice called out, not Scott's, but a younger one. Judge Ellison. It was a clerk, barely out of law school, his face flushed with urgency. He jogged toward Marcus, holding out a tablet. They want a statement for the press, he said breathlessly. They're asking if this is the start of something larger, if you're planning to push for a wider investigation. Marcus looked at the tablet without reaching for it. Let them ask. But, what should we tell them? Marcus turned his eyes to the young man and said, tell them that for the first time in a long time, the truth didn't flinch. And maybe that's the beginning of something. He walked away before another question could be asked. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the city and the courthouse emptied like a drained vessel, Marcus sat alone in his brownstone. The room was still. A record player spun quietly in the corner, Coltrane murmuring notes of both sorrow and triumph. The windows glowed orange with the final light of the day. He sipped tea slowly, hands steady, eyes distant. On the table in front of him was a photo. His mother, young and proud, standing beside him at his graduation. Her smile told 1,000 stories. She had fought battles he'd never had to. But today, he fought one she never lived to see resolved. And maybe, just maybe, some part of her was in that courtroom, standing beside him, helping him hold the silence with strength. He leaned back, exhaled, and for the first time in days, allowed himself to feel something he had kept buried beneath resolve. Relief. Not because it was over. But because it had begun. The conversation. The confrontation. The reckoning. And somewhere, miles away, in a smaller, darker room, Scott sat on the edge of a twin bed, reading the document Marcus had handed him. His hands still shook. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't reach for his badge to steady himself. He didn't have it anymore. What he had now, was a question. Who had he really been behind that uniform? And who did he want to be now that it was gone? That answer would take time. But it would begin with one word Marcus had left unspoken, yet written in every line of their final exchange. Accountability. The days that followed moved slowly, as though the city itself were holding its breath, unsure how to process what had just unfolded. The courtroom wasn't making headlines anymore, but the ripple effect of what had occurred inside it was far from over. Something invisible had cracked, something long buried had surfaced, and now it was everywhere, in dinner conversations, in morning commutes, in the quiet glances exchanged between citizens and officers on the streets. It wasn't loud, but it was present, unsettling, and it made people stop and think in a way they weren't used to. Not just about what had happened to Judge Marcus Ellison, but about what it meant for a country that still struggled to admit its own reflection. Marcus returned to his usual seat on the federal bench within the week. There was no press conference, no sweeping speech. He simply resumed his work, but those closest to him could feel the difference in how he walked through the courthouse now, not in confidence, but in burden. He had not just exposed a single man's misconduct, he had peeled back a layer of something systemic, something too many people had learned to live with. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that it took a man in Marcus's position, a man whose title granted him the power to be heard without shouting, for the truth to finally be acknowledged. And even then, it had only happened because he chose to wait, to let the evidence speak instead of the anger. Behind closed doors, the Department of Justice had launched a quiet internal audit of the Richmond Police Department. It wasn't announced to the public, but the department's leadership knew what it meant. Files were being reviewed. Patterns were being traced. Data that had been ignored for years was now being re-examined under a microscope, and Officer Delaney's name had become a keyword in that inquiry. But while the investigation deepened, so did the debate. Television panels, newspaper editorials, town halls, everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some praised Marcus for his restraint, calling his actions the embodiment of true justice. Others questioned if his silence had allowed the problem to fester for too long, if the very patience that made him honorable had also delayed a reckoning that could have spared others. Marcus never responded publicly. But those who knew him best understood that these were the thoughts that kept him up at night. He would sit in his study long after midnight, reading the letters that poured in from across the country. Some were from students who said they now saw the law as something worth fighting for. Others were from men who looked like him, who wrote in trembling words how they had once been the ones face down on the pavement, unheard, invisible. And then there were letters from officers, anonymous, apologetic, uncertain, confessing that they saw in Delaney a version of themselves they were afraid to confront. Marcus read each letter slowly, carefully. He wasn't seeking validation. He was seeking understanding, as if trying to map the outer edges of a pain that had no single name or source. Meanwhile, Delaney's world had shrunk. The house that once held the trophies of his career now felt like a museum to a life dismantled. He had returned his badge, his service weapon, his uniform. The routine that had once defined his existence, roll call, patrol routes, briefings, was gone, and in its place was a silence that was no longer peaceful. He had declined all interviews. His friends in the department had stopped calling, some out of discomfort, others out of fear that association with him would cost them their standing. For the first time in years, Scott Delaney was no one. Just a man with no shield between himself and the truth he had refused to face. He had enrolled in the restorative justice program Marcus had offered, though reluctantly. At first, he showed up stiff and defensive, expecting confrontation. But what he found were stories. Men and women who told him, not with rage, but with weary honesty, what it had felt like to be on the other end of suspicion that never asked for their name. Stories that mirrored his actions in ways that stripped away every excuse he had ever clung to. There were moments he wanted to walk out. Moments his shame threatened to swallow him whole. But he stayed. And slowly, the walls began to crack. One evening after a session, Scott approached the program director, a woman named Deja, whose brother had once been arrested under false pretenses and never fully recovered from the humiliation. Scott asked her, "Why does anyone even talk to me here? I wouldn't blame you if you turned your back." Deja looked at him for a long time before answering. "Because this program isn't about making you feel better," she said. "It's about giving us the power to tell our truth, with or without your understanding. You showing up doesn't fix anything. But it starts something. And starting is all we've ever been asking for." Back in the courthouse, Marcus found himself reflecting more and more on what justice meant outside the courtroom. His rulings were respected, his mind still sharp, but something inside him had shifted. The case with Delaney had been resolved, but the wound it uncovered had not. He began attending local community forums, not as a speaker, but as a listener. He sat quietly in the back, hearing stories of racial profiling, of fear passed down like inheritance, of the exhaustion that came from being questioned for existing. These were not new stories to him, but hearing them from strangers, spoken aloud in rooms where no one was under oath, felt different. It felt real in a way that the courtroom could never fully capture. Then came the letter. Not typed. Handwritten. Delivered by courier to his chambers, marked simply, "From Scott." Marcus sat alone when he opened it. The writing was uneven, like someone unused to expressing themselves this way. It didn't beg forgiveness. It didn't justify. It spoke of silence. Of how easy it had been for Scott to believe he was right for so long. Of how much harder it was to accept that being a good cop didn't mean he hadn't done harm. Of how the program had not redeemed him, but revealed him. The final line read, "I don't know if this means anything to you, but for the first time, I see you. Not as the man I arrested. As the man I refused to see." Marcus folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer as the others. But he didn't close the drawer right away. He let it sit open, like a doorway still waiting to be walked through. The city hadn't changed overnight. No law had been rewritten because of one courtroom decision. But something was different. Officers were being retrained. Community liaisons had been appointed. The word accountability no longer lived just in press releases. It had a face. And a name. Still, a question lingered in the air, one that neither Marcus nor Scott could answer alone. What does it truly mean to repair something built on silence? That question, heavy and unresolved, was the thread that now ran through every conversation about justice in Richmond. It was a question that refused easy answers, that invited discomfort, that required something more than policy, a reckoning of the heart. And the next time Marcus stood behind the bench, looking down at a courtroom full of strangers and familiar faces alike, he carried that question with him. Not as a burden. But as a guide. Because the story wasn't over. Not yet. The winter had settled in by the time Marcus received the invitation. It wasn't formal, not from the courts or any institution, it was handwritten, like the letter before it, and slipped into his mailbox with no return address. The card was simple, almost stark. Just a date, a time, and a place, the community center on 15th Street. Inside, a short note in familiar handwriting asked if he would be willing to attend the final session of the Restorative Justice Circle that Scott Delaney had been participating in. Not as a speaker. Not as a judge. Just as a presence. Marcus stared at the card for a long time, holding it between his fingers as though it might offer more meaning if he just gave it time. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't tell anyone. But the day of the session, just after sunset, he walked quietly through the cold streets of Richmond toward that building, each step guided not by duty, but by something more personal, more unresolved. The community center was small, humble, a space held together by care rather than funding. The walls were painted in calming earth tones, and folding chairs were arranged in a wide circle on a faded rug. There was no podium. No microphones. Just a low table in the middle with a pitcher of water and a single candle lit in the center, flickering like a heartbeat. When Marcus entered, heads turned. Not out of awe, but acknowledgement. A few participants nodded softly. Others shifted in their seats. And there, across the circle, sat Scott, clean-shaven, dressed plainly, not in uniform, not in performance. Just a man who had been asked to look in the mirror every week and stay seated while the truth stared back. Deja welcomed Marcus with a warm but quiet gesture. She didn't introduce him. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew who he was, and more importantly, they knew why he was there. He took a seat near the edge of the circle, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees, shoulders relaxed but alert. The room exhaled. The session began with silence, as they always did. A silence that allowed everything to settle, the nerves, the stories, the weight of what each person carried. Then Deja spoke, not with formality, but with grace. She reminded them all why they had come, what they had chosen to face, and what they had promised to hear. When she invited Scott to speak, there was no build-up. Just space. Scott cleared his throat, voice quieter than usual, as if unsure whether it deserved to be heard in this room. He didn't look at Marcus directly, but he didn't avoid him either. He began by talking about fear. Not of black men. Not of losing control. But of admitting that he had spent years confusing instinct with prejudice. He described moments from his past that had haunted him differently now, traffic stops, interrogations, interactions he had dismissed as standard procedure, but which, in hindsight, echoed the same assumptions that had led to that morning on the courthouse steps. He paused often. Sometimes just to breathe. Other times because his words caught somewhere between his throat and his conscience. He described the loneliness of losing his badge, but more deeply, the emptiness of realizing how much of his identity had been wrapped in authority instead of integrity. He said he had lived in a world where accountability was feared, not embraced, and that he had built walls around himself, convinced that silence was protection. Then his voice trembled, and he finally looked at Marcus. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't posture. He simply said, "I didn't just fail you. I failed myself. And I'm only starting to understand how deep that failure runs." Marcus didn't speak right away. His gaze was steady, but his chest rose with a long breath, and when he finally responded, it was not with judgment. It was with truth. He spoke of how easy it is to confuse power with purpose, how even good intentions can become weapons when left unexamined. He said he had spent a lifetime watching men like Scott enter rooms with confidence built on assumptions, and men like himself forced to carry proof of their worth in every gesture, every credential, every silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. But his words pierced the air with a clarity that made even the walls lean in. He said he had spent those hours in the holding cell not with rage, but with calculation. Wondering how many others had endured worse and never had the tools, the title, or the voice to tell their story. He said he hadn't chosen mercy over punishment because he was soft. He chose it because mercy, when paired with accountability, is the only thing that has the power to change a soul. And then, in a moment that no one expected, Marcus leaned forward, elbows on knees, and said, "This is not about whether you deserve redemption. It's about whether you're willing to live differently now that you've seen the truth. That's the only thing that matters." The room was still. Not frozen. Present. Something in Scott's eyes broke open, not in defeat, but in recognition. Not of what he had done, but of what he still had the power to do next. He nodded once, slowly, as if trying to make the motion permanent in his body. And for the first time, a few others in the circle shared their own stories directly with him. Some angry. Some weary. But all honest. And Scott listened. Without defense. Without retreat. He absorbed the weight, and in doing so, became a little lighter himself. After the session ended, most people lingered. They spoke softly, exchanging nods, handshakes, the occasional hug. Marcus stood near the door, coat in hand, when Scott approached. There was no tension, only gravity. "I don't know what happens next," Scott said. Marcus looked at him, then out toward the window where snow had started to fall. "Then you're finally in the right place to begin," he answered. Scott nodded again. Not as an ending, but as a choice. When Marcus stepped back out into the cold night, the air felt different. Not warm. Not forgiving. But honest. And that was enough. He walked slowly, hands in his coat pockets, the snow soft beneath his shoes, his breath rising in steady clouds. Somewhere behind him, the light of the community center stayed on, casting a faint glow into the night. The city was quiet again. But not the same kind of quiet. This silence held promise. In the weeks that followed the final session at the community center, the rhythm of life began to return to a steady pace, but underneath the surface, nothing remained quite the same. It wasn't just within the walls of the courthouse or inside the community halls where stories had been shared and tears had fallen, it was in the way people moved through the streets of Richmond, in the way officers began pausing longer before reacting, in the awareness that something deep, though fragile, had shifted. Judge Marcus Ellison could feel it each morning as he walked up the courthouse steps, no longer the same steps where he had once been pinned down in handcuffs, but now something reclaimed, something transformed. The officers on duty no longer glanced past him. They nodded with sincerity, and some even addressed him by name, not as a courtesy, but as a form of recognition that hadn't existed before. He didn't need it, but he noticed. And quietly, he acknowledged it too. One morning, as snow began to melt into the edges of the sidewalks and the city seemed to exhale with the coming of early spring, Marcus arrived at his chambers to find a letter waiting on his desk. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, unfamiliar. Inside, the message was short: "I know there are others. And I know now that silence is a choice. If there's any way I can help repair what I helped break, I'm ready. S." There was no return address, no official seal, just a sentence that carried the weight of a man who had finally begun to grasp the cost of what his silence, and his presence in power, had done. Marcus folded the letter and placed it beside the others. There was a quiet comfort in seeing the collection grow, not because it signaled closure, but because it marked movement. Reflection. Willingness. Later that afternoon, Marcus met with one of his clerks, a young woman named Asha, who had been watching everything unfold from the periphery. Bright, observant, and not afraid to ask hard questions, she had been silent during most of the ordeal, processing it not with detachment but with the kind of careful thought that mirrored Marcus's own methods. That day, after a long silence in his office, she finally spoke. "You know, they're starting to say this case changed how departments across the state are running internal reviews, right?" she said, her eyes fixed on the stack of rulings he was reviewing. "They're using your name as a reference point. Like it's a precedent." Marcus glanced up, setting the papers aside. He studied her expression, part admiration, part hesitation. "People will use any story to justify the side they're already on," he said slowly. "It doesn't matter what I intended. It only matters how they remember it." Asha tilted her head, folding her arms. "Isn't that still power? Even if it's misused?" Marcus leaned back in his chair. "It is. And that's the part that worries me. Because for every story like mine that ends in accountability, there are 100 others that disappear before they ever start. That courtroom wasn't justice. It was a chance. A rare one." Asha leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter now. "But you took it. And you didn't burn it down. That means something." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then offered a small, tired smile. "It means I still believe people can change. Even when the world tells you not to." Meanwhile, Scott Delaney had started volunteering twice a week at the same community center where he'd sat through the restorative justice program. Not as a speaker, not to tell his story, but to set up chairs, carry supplies, serve coffee, small, invisible acts. He didn't want to be seen. He didn't want to be congratulated. He just wanted to be present. There was a humility in his movements, the kind that only comes from having something taken that you didn't realize you were misusing until it was gone. And though some in the room still met him with wary glances, others began to soften, not because they forgave him, but because they could see he wasn't there to be forgiven. He was there to listen. One evening, Deja approached him as he folded up the last of the chairs. Her voice was low, but intentional. "You're not the same man who sat in this circle 6 months ago," she said, wiping down the last table. Scott didn't look up at first. "I'm trying not to be," he said after a moment. Deja nodded. "Trying is not nothing. But it's not everything either. Don't forget that. He finally looked at her, eyes heavy but open. I don't want to forget. I want to feel it. Every time I show up. She paused, watching him closely. Then keep showing up. Even when no one claps for it. Especially then. In the courthouse, Marcus was asked to speak at a regional conference for judges and legal professionals. The request came with enthusiasm, but also political interest. They wanted to hear about his experience and the landmark case that was changing the conversation. Marcus declined. He sent a letter instead, stating that his story didn't belong on a panel. It belonged in the quiet rooms where policies are made, where training manuals are rewritten, where culture is shaped not by applause but by deliberate, often invisible labor. And instead of taking the stage, he arranged a private session with a group of incoming law clerks, young, hungry, and filled with a kind of curiosity that reminded him of his own early days. He told them about the law, not in broad strokes, but in detail. How it isn't a shield for the powerful, but a structure meant to hold all of us accountable. How it fails when people with badges or robes forget that they, too, must be questioned. And then he shared something that surprised them. He admitted that part of him wanted to walk away after the Delaney case. That he had felt the weight of it pressing down on his will to continue. But what stopped him was a simple truth: if the only people who remain in power are those who feel entitled to it, then nothing ever changes. One of the students, a young black man named Terrence, raised his hand. What kept you from hating him? He asked, voice careful, almost hesitant. After what he did. After what so many of us go through every day. Marcus looked at him with a depth that only years of restraint could carve. I didn't hate him, he said quietly. I hated what made him possible. And that's not the same. Terrence lowered his eyes, nodding slowly. The room fell silent again, not with discomfort, but reflection. Outside those rooms, the city continued to live. There were still stops that went wrong, still headlines that hurt. But something had begun to form, conversations that didn't die in outrage but carried into policy drafts, into classroom discussions, into kitchen table debates. Marcus knew the road was long, uneven, and full of backslides. But he also knew that silence was no longer an option. Not for him. Not for those who had seen what happened when a man chose not to shout, but to stand. One morning, as the sun poured over the steps of the courthouse like golden syrup, Marcus stood at the top, briefcase in hand. A small group of high school students was visiting on a civic field trip, and one of the teachers pointed him out as they ascended. That's Judge Ellison, she whispered to a student. He's the one I told you about. The one who. Marcus turned and smiled at them, pausing his stride. The students quieted, staring up at him as if seeing a monument still breathing. He stepped closer, his voice gentle but steady. Don't be afraid to question what justice looks like, he said. Even when it's wearing a badge. Even when it's wearing a robe. They didn't say much. But the way they looked at him, some with admiration, some with uncertainty, spoke volumes. They were the future. And maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't need to carry the same burdens if people like Marcus kept showing up, if people like Scott kept sitting in hard rooms, if people like Deja kept making space for truth, even when it came from unexpected mouths. The courthouse doors opened behind him, and he turned to walk inside. Not because the story was finished. But because the work was still going. The spring that followed was unlike any other Richmond had seen in years. It wasn't the weather, though the skies were clearer and the breeze softer, it was something in the people, in the way they walked a little more aware, listened a little longer, paused before speaking where once they'd rushed to assumptions. Change hadn't swept through like a storm. It had crept in quietly, almost unannounced, carried on the shoulders of those who'd been broken, humbled, and rebuilt. And in the center of it all stood Marcus Ellison, no longer just a federal judge, no longer just a name cited in legal circles. He had become something more powerful than a title, he had become a symbol of what it meant to confront power not with noise, but with courage shaped by truth. Months had passed since the hearings. Policy shifts began to unfold statewide. Police departments started implementing implicit bias reviews not just once a year, but monthly, and not just on paper, but through lived, guided interactions. Community review boards were no longer symbolic. They had teeth now, armed with data, access, and protected voices. And it hadn't happened because of a scandal, it happened because the person most wronged refused to let the story be hijacked by anger or forgotten in silence. And while his name was attached to the wave, Marcus made sure to never claim it. In every interview he finally agreed to, every forum he was invited to moderate, he repeated the same thing: accountability without ego, justice without spectacle, presence without fear. His voice, measured and unshaking, became a grounding force. He was offered positions on national committees, even a nomination for a potential circuit court promotion. He declined all of it. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because he had found something deeper, a way to serve that didn't come with ceremony. He began mentoring young black law students across the country, started a fellowship program named not after himself, but after the names that had gone unheard, names that would never sit behind a bench, but whose stories deserved to echo through the halls of justice. He traveled quietly, gave lectures that were part legal doctrine, part moral compass. Students followed him out of the classrooms not just with notebooks filled, but hearts stirred. He had become the very kind of man his father once imagined when he'd said, "Change doesn't always shout, it builds." And Scott Delaney? His journey didn't end in disgrace. It ended in something rarer: transformation. He didn't return to law enforcement. He didn't attempt to restore his former identity. Instead, he took a job with a local outreach organization that helped previously incarcerated men reintegrate into society. At first, no one wanted to work with him. He understood. He didn't ask for trust, he earned it slowly, day by day, action by action. He taught job readiness, helped expunge nonviolent records, worked behind the scenes to push local employers to reconsider their hiring biases. And in that work, he found something he never had while wearing a badge: purpose rooted not in control, but in contribution. There were still people who crossed the street when they saw him. Still whispers. But he no longer chased absolution. He chased service. There was one particular day that no one expected. A panel discussion hosted at the university, titled "Repair and Responsibility." The last name added to the program, written in small print at the bottom of the flyer, S. Delaney. When he stepped onto the stage beside Marcus, there was a hush. No cameras. No applause. Just curiosity. And when Scott spoke, nervously at first, he didn't recount the past in detail. He spoke instead about the power of being seen not just in your success, but in your failure. He talked about how being stripped of his uniform had not destroyed him, but revealed him. And he turned to Marcus once, just once, and said, "You didn't just hold me accountable. You forced me to look in a mirror I'd spent my whole life avoiding. And I'll never forget what I saw." That moment wasn't broadcast. It wasn't clipped for social media. But for those who were there, it stayed burned in memory. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Years later, Marcus would walk into a courtroom in another city, called in to oversee a constitutional review for a police misconduct case. As he passed through the hall, a young officer stopped him. Nervous, fidgeting. He introduced himself and said softly, "Sir, I became a cop because of what you taught us. That justice starts with how we see people before we judge them." Marcus smiled, placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, and said, "Then make sure you never forget that. Because sometimes, one look is the difference between harm and humanity." And somewhere far from that courtroom, on a late Sunday afternoon, Scott stood at a job fair helping a young man fill out his first resume. The man had just been released after 4 years, unsure of where to begin. Scott handed him a folder, looked him in the eye, and said, "You don't have to be the mistake you made. That's not who you are anymore." The man smiled, the kind of hesitant smile that only comes when someone sees you not for what you've done, but for what you're trying to become. This story didn't end with punishment. It ended with impact. With the knowledge that justice is not simply a verdict or a sentence. It's a living, breathing commitment, a choice that must be made again and again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And now, to you who've watched this story unfold, from humiliation to revelation, from power abused to truth reclaimed, I ask you, what would you do if the one who wronged you stood before you, completely vulnerable? Would you destroy them? Or would you demand something greater? Because in this world, justice that only punishes changes very little. But justice that transforms, that shakes the very ground we walk on. So tell us in the comments, what moved you in this story? What do you think real justice looks like? We want to hear from you. And if this story stirred something in you, if it challenged you, if it made you feel seen, subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this. Stories that don't just entertain, but open eyes and change hearts. And don't forget to leave a like to support this channel and help this message reach others who need to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.